Fire Emblem is a franchise I got into around probably the same time that many others did, with Fire Emblem Awakening. I had watched a playthrough of Fire Emblem on the GBA a long time ago, but Awakening was the first time I actually had played it myself. I absolutely adored it. Many mechanics all playing at the same time, having to create a sound strategy with considering all these different things, and I really enjoyed the story at the same time. The supports brought in depth to many of these characters that normally would never get any kind of character development. I ended up picking up Fire Emblem Fates pretty soon after I played Awakening, and I was greatly disappointed, honestly. It just didn't hook me the same way Awakening did. Similarly, Fire Emblem Three Houses hooked me so much on the story and the characters, way more than even the previous two games did, but I really quickly got bored of the gameplay with it from the second half. I found the strategy part got really stale by the end, and it was just about hitting as hard as you can on the enemies. Finally, Fire Emblem Engage honestly really bored me all the way through. That's a discussion for another time. What's important is Fire Emblem Engage focuses on past Fire Emblem games a lot, which made me want to try out some of the old ones. I figured going back to one I'm somewhat familiar with would be best. As such, today we'll be talking about Fire Emblem on the GBA, also known as Fire Emblem the Blazing Blade, or simply Fire Emblem, or even Fire Emblem 7. Wait, how many names does this game have? As a new school Fire Emblem fan, this will be my first time actually playing the game. I have seen gameplay before though. And one last thing to note, the version I'm playing has a bit of a quality of life enhancement mods added to it. Doesn't change the gameplay, just add some stuff like health bars to the game. Fire Emblem, for those who have not played it before, is a strategy RPG game where you lead a small army, usually around a max of 16 characters, into a battle. The battles are turn-based, so it's all about planning your move and making the right choice. What makes Fire Emblem unique are two main mechanics that are unique to this franchise over any other franchise: supports, which will be going over later, and permanent death. Permanent death, the idea is when your characters die, they actually have died and cannot be used again. All the investment and experience you use on that character lost as well. This is a fantastic mechanic since it forces you to think more carefully. You can't just throw your units at a problem to beat it to submission. You need to think carefully, otherwise a surprise could be waiting for you at any moment. I've always disliked this mechanic in the newer games, but I think it's clear with this game it was at least built around it. In Fire Emblem Three Houses, your party on a normal playthrough is really small. On top of that, because of the smaller roster, each character matters way more to the overarching story. In that sense, the mechanic doesn't really work from a gameplay and story perspective, since when you lose a unit, you're essentially losing a major part, or at least a significant section of the story. In this game, however, you are constantly getting new units to be able to replace the old ones. Due to the size of the roster, each individual one doesn't really matter too much to the overarching story, meaning the whole permanent death mechanic makes more sense here. There's even story integration going on here, with how a scene can play out differently depending on if a character is alive at that point or dead. One particular kind of unit that I kept losing a lot in the game was a paladin, the horseback riders. I lost a majority of the paladins available to you in the game, but it was okay since there was usually a new character coming around that could replace them. The mechanic meant even though I was hurt losing some of these units, especially those I invested in heavily into, I at least can never have to restart my playthrough ever because there's always another unit to replace them. While on this note, let's go over how every one of my characters died. Urk died in chapter 16. I forgot about an archer from the south, and in combination with the one from the north, it killed him. I didn't have a mage for half the game because of this. Priscilla basically died twice technically. Once since I accidentally activated some enemies on one of the chapters and restarted it, and then again she died the chapter right after. Sane died in chapter 15, the same chapter you finally get him back, to a 66% chance since I forgot to heal him. Kent, the other member of the duo, died in chapter 29 when I overestimated his abilities to take hits and died to a 41% critical hit, wearing him down plus a magic attack right after. Ninian died on chapter 25 to a random attack across the map, the first one having a 27% chance to hit, and the second in the same round having a 44% chance to hit. Heath died in chapter 25, again for the same reasons as Ninian. Isidore died just because of bad position on my part. Florina died to a crit on the final chapter. Luis died to Pent due to a berserk staff on Pent which made him attack our allies. And then in turn, Pent also left. Lucius died to a crit again on the final chapter. Canas died in the final chapter as well, since I needed something to wear the dragon down, and Athos also died in the final chapter to protect everyone else against the dragon. As you can see, I lost a lot of people in the final chapter. We'll get to that eventually. You'll notice in the last section, I talked a lot about percentages. The way Fire Emblem works in terms of every kind of battle round is there's three main numbers that matter. Your attack, which is how much damage you're going to do to the enemy. Your hit percentage, which is basically your chance of actually hitting the enemy. And crit percentage, which is basically your chance of landing a critical strike on the enemy. In the newer games, accuracy is a lot more favorable to the player. There essentially is an updated formula which makes it essentially, if you have a high enough accuracy percentage, they roll twice to check to see if you get the hit. In this game, it's true accuracy, meaning whatever is written on there, that's your actual chance of hitting the opponent. For this reason, I actually found the system to be better. It meant something like a dodge tank. Someone who's like purely good at dodging can be a frontline fighter, since they can just simply survive on that alone. In the previous games, I wouldn't have cared the difference between a 75% to a 90%, but here, it actually mattered a lot about which weapon I chose depending on the accuracy. Next, let's go over map design. I loved it, way more than 3 houses, probably on the same level as Engage. Each map felt unique, either due to the actual mechanics like Fog of War, where you have limited visibility, or Rain, where some turns you can't move as far. Some could be as simple as having aggressive enemies, but I think what I liked most was the story integration on map designs. A good example is one chapter where you're facing off against the remains of the Black Fang. The organization is essentially gone at this point from a story perspective, so they're purely out for a misunderstood revenge. They cannot be reasoned with. So what they do for a map design to showcase that is these enemies are way more aggressive compared to other enemies on other maps. Most other maps, enemies won't even start moving until you're in your range. Here enemies will be going across the entire giant map, constantly pushing towards you non-stop. There's many reinforcements also arriving, constantly pushing at you. And this makes so much sense from the context of the story. They're just out for revenge now. They can't think properly, they just want to kill you as nothing else matters to them at this point. Another thing that was unique was where some maps could have a form of a bonus objective. For example, you could have a map with hostages, and it's your job to keep some of them alive in addition to the normal objective, and in doing so, you unlock a bonus chapter. This meant on replay playthroughs you could experience new things. I think the final chapter does a great job of bringing all this together. It has a unique map design compared to all the other maps where it consists of only boss enemies you may have faced previously, just with way higher stats. Furthermore, I had a lot of issues with accuracy and crits on this one, as I've mentioned previously with how many characters died. And because of that, I had lost many characters for the first half of the map, and when the second half started, I was cut down to half my team to take on the final boss. It does a really great job of showing all the different mechanics playing together at once and made it such a fun but challenging experience. The story is split into 3 pieces among the 3 main characters, Lynn, Elowood, and Hector, but really it's more like a part 1 and part 2, where Lynn's story tells part 1, and Elowood and Hector tell part 2. We can kind of choose who the main character is, and thus changes minor things here and there in the story. In part 1 we journey with Lynn, a member of a tribe that lives on the plains alone after her parents had died. She sets out to get revenge, but quickly learns of her secret heritage as a noble woman and how her grandfather, her last surviving family member, is involved in a hostile coup for power. Through this journey, she gains allies and learns of the bigger world and what her place in all of it is. It's a simple story, but it does its job. It acts as a tutorial, and the story helps with the aspect of it being the beginning chapters. The conflicts are smaller, and the enemies are not trained professionals. You wouldn't be expected to be facing real battles yet as a player. I honestly don't have really much to say about this story. It does its job and it's enjoyable enough. Lynn is a fun main character, but she doesn't leave any lasting impressions. It was nice going through a more lighthearted story in a Fire Emblem game. I did enjoy the focus of how Lynn struggles with her nobility, and that gets expanded more on in part 2 for her. Part 2 we journey with Hector, Elowood, and later on Lynn too, as they look for Elowood's father while unraveling a mystery that threatens the entire continent. This is where the real meat of the story is. The story is really different from the rest of the series I've played so far. In other games, it's full kingdoms going to war with each other with larger stakes and threats out in the open and known. Here though, stakes are smaller. We're not dealing with full kingdoms going to war, just a small band of mercenaries essentially. The enemies are also pretty much unknown for most of the game, and half the story is learning who the enemies really are and what their motives are. The second half is then finding a way to defeat said enemies. There's still the usual tropes of dragons the series is known about, but it takes more of a backseat compared to the other games. It's also important to note this game is technically a prequel. See, Fire Emblem 6, the one that before this one, is a Binding Blade, which takes place in the same place but decades later. Because of it, there's an entire section that feels separate from the rest of the story, but that's because it's done to build up one of the major characters in the previous game. You can see that coming full circle in the post-credits scene as well. The issue is, Fire Emblem 6 has never come out to the West. It is a Japanese exclusive game, meaning that post-credits scene, or at least for the Western audience, has never been resolved. Overall, I really enjoyed the story. Elowood, while on the surface, seems like a pretty average character. It's so noble that it becomes interesting again. He's a character that's challenged for his ignorance, and due to it hurts many people along the way, but despite that, never loses his way. Hector is a person who learns to grow up from being a brash young man ready to fight, to learning to take responsibility and lead as a monarch. And Lynn learns the importance of learning from others and learns of different perspectives, all while overcoming past traumas. But probably what's most important in terms of characters' development are their supports. I won't go into any detail on any particular support too much, as there are many great other videos purely focused on them. This has got to be one of some of the best support writing I've ever seen. However, what I do want to focus on as an example is specifically Matthew's support with Jafar. For context, Matthew is a spy for the Kingdom of Ostia, Hector's kingdom, and up to this point he has had a very cheerful and lighthearted demeanor in both Part 1 and Part 2. We also learn of another spy helping Ostia, Layla, in Part 2, who gets caught and killed by Jafar halfway through the story. Jafar, due to circumstances in story, joins the party later on as well. Now we have this kind of situation in other games of an enemy turned ally, but often the supports just ignore this context, just so they can have some lighthearted banter. Matthew's Jafar support is all about this, however. In the C support, in the first support, Matthew asked about the spy that was killed and innocently asked if he knew of her due to both being the Black Fang at the time. He leads him on and explains that it must have been someone very skilled, someone who's earned the title as one of the 4 Fangs. And eventually he decides it must have been him. Jafar responds and confirms it was him who killed Layla, and immediately Matthew goes in for the kill. He wants his revenge and does not care if they're allies now, he wants him dead. This is such a sharp contrast to his personality up to this point in the story and in other supports, yet it makes sense. And that's what is great about many of these characters. They have multiple sides to their personality, but they feel right rather than just feeling something they threw in randomly. In the B support, Matthew tries to kill him again, but this time Jafar gets the upper hand. Except in death, he says Layla's name, but Jafar doesn't kill him. Matthew lashes out in anger in response to this, and tells him he will dedicate his entire life to killing Jafar. Finally, things change in the A support. Matthew takes advantage of Jafar's care for another character, Nino, and uses an underhand tactic not seen by Matthew before to finally get his way. He finally gets a chance to kill Jafar. Jafar accepts his death if it keeps Nino alive, and yet in that moment, Matthew can't kill him. He questions if this is the right move and chooses not to. He explains that Elo had told him that how he acted only on Nurgle's command and not his own, and up to this point he's not really lived his own life. That doesn't change how he feels about Jafar, but he realizes he was only doing this to satisfy himself rather than for Layla. Jafar gives him one last statement, saying Matthew was the final words Layla said before her death. This is a fantastic support, showing not only Matthew's other side, not really ever seen anywhere else in the game, but bringing closure to an important part of the story that is essential to Matthew's character and Jafar. Providing Jafar a moment of vulnerability not really seen anywhere else either, and tells an important message about not getting lost in revenge. All of this done in essentially 6 minutes worth of dialogue, and these aren't even the main characters. I think that's Blazing Sword's greatest strength in the story. Its characters are some of the best in the franchise, and while the story's probably only okay, but the gameplay integration with the story brings it up a notch. Overall, I think this really helped me appreciate more of what the franchise has to offer. Of course, it's not a perfect experience to come back to, and honestly, I probably wouldn't recommend it as a first experience of Fire Emblem anymore, but it's well worth your playing if you're a Fire Emblem fan. The game has a story that, while not the largest, is very personal and does a better job of getting the player into it than many other Fire Emblem games could. It takes the core Fire Emblem mechanics of permanent death and supports and brings them into their A game. In the West, the game simply has a title of Fire Emblem, and deservedly so, as it is simply the best representation of what Fire Emblem at its core is. See you next video, like and subscribe if you enjoyed it.